holding story over a long period of time. So through eons, how people would pass stories down as a group or to people, much the same way a classroom works, and how you would pass lessons on through song or through word or through poetry, and
That's right. Yeah.
and that's a really powerful message transition over time. I mean, is that how you still feel now? Is that the role of a bard today?
It's still pretty much applicable. Yeah. I mean, the role, because you've got to kind of differentiate between the role of the bard of then and the role of the bard now. Um, it's a bit like the cover, because I just to reiterate, and for any new listeners, I'm a member of an order called the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, which is a druidic order. And there are three levels, which are the Bards, the Ovates, and the Druids. The Bards are spiritual exploration through creativity. So whether that's storytelling, acting, music, poetry, it covers all of those bases there. So I've done that now. I think I was still at the Bardic grade when I was talking to you originally about
Yeah.
this. Whereas now I'm on the Ovate level, which is the level of can't say level, that's not the word. The grade, there we go. So the Ovate grade is exploring the world of nature. So if you're starting off in the Bardic sense and exploring folklore, exploring myths and tales and such, and then an introduction into the world of magic and meaning, so to speak, then the Ovate grade is an exploration of that. So it's coming into contact with the natural world all around us, how we are still part of it, and how we're still of this earth. We're not entirely separate from it. And then the Druidic grade is more about diplomacy and networking and working with society and such. So, sorry for the digress. I just thought I'd re-establish
No,
ground before we
it's an
carry on.
interesting point because when you think about those three levels, effectively, to my understanding, that's the same three levels that exist in Freemasonry. It's the idea you would, and I think they're actually still called Bard, Ovate, and Druidic. Is that they are? I think it's the opening three levels of Freemasonry, where, and I could be mistaken because of course there's many different versions. I'm sure one is to understand yourself, and then is to understand and become a teacher and teach other people and learn and pass stories on. And then at Druidic level, like you said, is diplomacy, and not necessarily politics, but it's a way that we can interact and communicate with each other. And I guess
Yeah,
that's quite interesting. Do you think that at one time, then, say the Druidic and Freemasonry, I guess, were the same, and one's broke off from the other? Is that
I
possible?
would say that a lot of mod. Again, this is where I say you've got to compare it to the Druidic order, with what being a bard is, because druids of back then they didn't do all of this. A druid was a professor. It was the Celtic caste system of being a professor, of being an intellectual. Some of them were surgeons, some were judges, some were philosophers, some were doctors and practitioners of medicine. But the druid was a kind of cover-all term for this group of people who did all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so like
Um,
professionals of their level, really.
yes, there we go. So professionals of the level. Whereas now, druid is perhaps a combination of all those things, depending on which order of druids you belong to. I'm really sorry, my phone's going to keep beeping because I'm talking to you on my phone, which
Sure.
means I need my Wi-Fi, and everyone on WhatsApp's now talking to each other. It's like, for fuck's sake, shut the hell up. Um, yeah.
I deliberately
So,
quieted everything. Just that didn't happen.
okay, we'll just ignore it.
Okay,
Um, so,
it's fine.
so yes, what we're saying. Oh yeah. So we're talking about druids and what
So
they
then
are. Is that
today,
where we were?
yeah. So kind of druids today, that kind of how the three levels have almost become interchangeable, and they're all
Right. I
together.
see. Yeah. 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 So because the druid of the past was the keeper of law, both in terms of law and tradition, and also the law as in, well, if you commit a crime, then you have to compensate the victim for that
Yeah.
kind of law. Um, because they didn't really have a prison system. They had
I guess it'd be okay.
compensation system. So, say for example, I murdered somebody. That would be at best I would be excommunicated from the tribe and kicked out, and then left to fend for myself. If I committed some kind of theft, I would be excluded from the
Trade.
feast table
Okay.
and from trade, and I would also have to recompense my victim for that. So whoever I stole from, I would have to give back in some way, whether that's a term of service or I have made a life boon to protect this family, or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, modern druids are a mixture of storyteller, musician, poet, diviner, seer, healer, spiritual healing sense, and community networker. It's all of those things now. So a druid of back then would not necessarily recognise a druid of today, and vice
So
versa.
I guess the role is has
It's
diversified, but has
yeah,
also taken on new
yeah,
characteristics. Okay.
yeah. About the Freemason thing, I don't know about that. But what I will say is, I think a lot of modern druidry takes a lot of its inspirations from Masonry,
Yeah.
because around the time of what was called the Druid Renaissance, which actually was end of 16th century all the way up to the 20th century, a lot of the people who were interested in druids back then were people who began to romanticize them and painted them as this kind of savage barbarian culture, and so it was very fashionable to go on about, oh yes, let's look at the Greek accounts of the druids, who say that they had sacred groves that were gloomy places and they sacrificed people by the dozen. Can you believe this?
Well, I
And at
guess
the same time, they wanted to reconnect this and made it into something very, very different. It's basically a poor man's version of a fraternity system.
yeah, I can see that because I guess it would have to exist underground, or that the romanticization of it would have to be imagined. So we'll
Yeah,
imagine
and
them. I suppose.
originally, okay, so the people who actually created the ancient order of druids, even though they only created it a couple of years ago, back in 17 something or other, they actually got together so they could play music and poetry to each other. And throughout time, it became well known because they all met up in a pub in London, Covent Garden, I think it was. And over time, it just became this huge thing with all the pomp and circumstance of Freemasonry. So they all had golden torques, sashes, symbols, everything, a lot. So they perhaps took a lot of inspiration from the Freemasonry and pretty much made their own version of that.
I was going to say that's quite interesting because I wonder if that's because a bard generally is someone who has travelled around quite extensively, and there's a particular chap who comes to mind whose name is on the tip of my tongue, but not quite there, and he was trying to gather pirate songs and seafarer songs from all across the country. And
Oh yeah,
and he started releasing like CDs of these songs, so they were never forgotten. And I think in many ways a bard did that. You know, you travel from town to town
yes,
to village, and you would learn local lore, local history, local myths, stories, and you would tell them in a different town to a different audience who
yeah,
were like, "Oh, what's this all about?" And that's and you kind of wonder when these musicians or when these poets got together, it's kind of like, well, when I was in this town, look what I learned over here in Coventry, and look what I learned over here. It effectively was, an early version of people's internet, really. They were sharing
yeah,
stories that they'd
yeah.
found on the road.
That's it. And so to go back to the original question is what it is the role of a bard applicable in the 21st century? I think my original answer to that in the original talk we did was it isn't. Whereas actually that was my perspective has changed on that. So I'll get onto that in a minute. But what I will say is I think you're absolutely right in saying that it was the early version of the World Wide Web. But no, people traveled. People went to different towns and villages and settlements and so forth. And so with that, you learned news. You learned news of those places and also brought news with you. And shared folk songs and stories and tales and folklore and things. Um, that's perhaps one reason why Robin Hood is like known throughout all of England, as opposed to just in Nottingham,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Um, I know there are people who say different, and that perhaps Robin Hood was actually the name of a gang member, and there were so many Robin Hoods because there were so many gangs. Um, I think all are applicable and all are true. But nowadays, of course, we don't have that. And a bard, we forget a bard, was also responsible for entertaining the court. So the local lord's court or the king's court. They would entertain and tell jokes and tell the news and tales. But also, it was their job to pass on status. And so if
Like pageantry.
someone wanted to be disgraced, if someone wanted to disgrace somebody else, then the bard would be employed to do exactly just that. And it was also illegal in medieval times to attack a jester, who would be a descendant of the bard, because a jester wasn't just a fool. The jester was also there to provide status by word of mouth. Basically, if you badmouth somebody, that means their reputation's gone down the sinkhole. That's it for them.
Oh, so actually, in many ways, it was like their role was almost to be disingenuous about someone. They could tell a story or tell a fabrication, and they would tell somebody else, and the word would get around about how bad this person was, or how they didn't pay their
Yeah.
tax or do their certain thing, would disgrace them publicly. And I guess like today, if you're a public figure, you could say something on Twitter or Facebook. It shares out really fast. But in those days, of course, you had to tell the next town, and you had to tell the next people. So yeah, I can see how such a system actually was employed.
Yeah, I mean, there's also another reason there why actors were looked upon at the same level as being a prostitute,
Yeah,
because they travel and perform, and they pass on information, and they create these satires of noble people, and get the common people laughing at them, and so on and so forth.
interesting.
Yeah, I told you. Like I said, my perspective changed. So I would say, is a bard applicable to the 21st century? Yes. Yes, it would, because it's a tradition. It's not just a tradition in the sense of being passed down from word to mouth. It's also a tradition in that all performers are in the same guild, so to speak. So all your dancers tend to be dancers together, or your actors, even though there are many different kinds of performances, whether it's TV, whether it's theatre, whether it's street theatre, they all come from the same kind of interest of theatre. And so there's a need to perform and need to create. And even though nowadays we have television and the internet to provide us our news and our information, and indeed folklore, whether it's genuine or not, whether it's recent or not, those roles would have been given to the bard originally. But people are creative, and I would say that anybody who's creative is still carrying on that bardic thing. So if you're talking, is the bard who's learned all of his stanzas of poetry and stories from the 6th century, I don't think anybody falls into that at all, unless they're a recreationist. But there's no actual tradition from the 6th century, say, all the way up to the 21st. But anybody who is a creative person who wants to perform or put information out, that's still the role of the bard, but reinterpreted. The job may have been distributed back to different performers, but it's still kind of there. We just call it different things now. Actor, dancer, pop star, newsreader, comedian, stand-up, so on and so forth.